whether known or unknown, at a point when power, significant asymmetric power, is in place, it doesn't stay in place and held by that person for long unless they recognise that this is the immediate threat, and that this story to be presented to the citizenry of nationhood and the state and all the rest of it is the number one and immediate way of applying control.
What happens when when it is just a permanent crisis? Then there is no factual basis. And I think one of the things he's saying is that the exceptions becoming the norm because the system, neoliberal capitalism, whatever, is anarchic. It is anarchy.
Yeah.
This is the anarchy. You're not protecting against the anarchy. We live in it.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
Thus, there can be no exception to democratic norms which do not exist in the first place other than as a story to nullify opposition. What is perceived as the state of exception is more like an occurrence of unveiling, whereby normally concealed tyranny is forced to suspend the illusion of democracy to properly administer its ongoing and total hegemony. During periods when the dominant narrative is unsustainable, a revealing, or apocalypse in biblical terms, occurs in which power becomes fully visible. The traumatic shock of the governed in response to this unveiling is in itself of great or even greatest utility to the tendencies and influences which lay behind all old and future power structures. Because like exactly what we keep coming back to with the fear. People's response to the whole COVID thing is mostly based on fear, and if people are traumatized and in shock, I think like people now are looking at this unveiling like we've talked about it and the way it's going on a small level with COVID it's gone on. I don't think they go. Some people do. I think it denotes which way you go. Like the two different personality types. Some people go, "Oh my God, look at what's going on," to the extreme level. Some of our friends, and then to the level where we're like progressively, there is something to this. There's more going on here than the media tell us, kind of thing. And then other people, the vast majority, react reflexively, emotionally, and in the opposite direction of "I can't bear this." It's like finding out your parents are full of shit, and you just go into denial rather than just addressing that and growing from it.
So just to be clear, so you're saying that when power's unveiled through the use of the state of exception, then most people, that is actually of utility to power because most people
partly.
Most people kind of respond to that in a sort of trauma-based way, and therefore it's kind of, subconsciously or consciously, they're like, it's like the father that's just kind of, demonstrated aggression or whatever, and it's like, oh my God, I don't want to provoke that again.
Yeah, and to the extent that, and I'd say, but I'm putting the agency with the power as well, that when a power, and I can say this, if I was in some sort of hegemonic control over the current political state of affairs, and I saw, say, the emergent conspiracy movement or the alternative, just in a very rational sense, emerging, and people in large swathes starting to react in this polar opposite. So you've got on one side the people who see the world normally, traditionally, and then these people are saying, no, it's all a conspiracy, or there's all these things going on, or that going on, and we all know that populates a broad continuum of viewpoints, some of which are extremely evidence-based and very, very credible, and some of which are horseshit. But as that power structure, if I saw those narratives emerging, my objective, personally, wouldn't be to try and suppress them. My objective would be, for them to be allowed to emerge in ways that serve me in other ways anyway, but on the understanding that that it's fear and division, and it's it's just paralysis, and the number one thing I'm shooting for in my citizenry is paralysis that forces them to look for a salvationary figure to rescue them, i.e. the state or however that power is manifest. The answer to all the above would seem to be, in the short term, to undermine and overcome reactive fear, and in the long term, to heal and prevent the trauma by which decent human beings can always be relied upon to act knowingly and unknowingly like animals. Trauma is the single obstacle. This is the bottom line. Trauma is the single obstacle to human liberty on that basis, that by being traumatized we're very easily controlled. Fear, inadequately understood and responded to, is the seed of trauma. sovereignty and the legitimate power it bestows is the antidote to trauma, feeling empowered within. Even if you could be fighting the greatest oppressor that's ever existed, if you're in the fight and you know that you have sovereign power and you know that the most they can do is kill you, and you died as free a man as there's ever been, you're as free a man as there's ever been. Even if you're in that fight, you're just deprived of living a certain life you might want to live, but no one gets to live the precise life they want to live. You're in the game, you know, you're in your experience. Yeah, maybe he would listen to everything I just said and said, yeah, nothing there, it contradicts what I'm saying. And maybe he'd have a reason why he could explain that. But it seems to me like when we're talking at the level of what his model implies, we're talking at the level of a recognition of history that is very much in keeping with what people tend to believe, that we do live under democratic systems in the West and that maybe they're flawed and maybe they're evolving and all the rest of it. Whereas the proposition I'm putting forward at the first about the citizenry being the de facto, the automatic primary threat, it's almost like everything else is in that cartelization sense of power as well. What you'd expect to see, it would make sense that basically states are looking at each other, really, and saying, "You got yours? Yeah, I've got mine." Like, you know, it's not even like, and in the 1984 sense, the basis under which there would ever be wars would be far more likely to be in order to support these narratives of our state versus your state, whereas it's not in any state structure's interests to chase resources in the monkey chasing monkey way that we know that people tend to function. When it's a cartel, you've got a very limited number of people on the planet who control all the power on the planet, and in just the same as happens in a smaller microcosm in terms of cartels, as in drugs cartels, to use the example, they don't fight each other for long because they recognize there's a very certain tipping point where they go, whoa, we've got a bigger threat here, and it's the CIA or it's the whatever. Whereas, and in this version of events, it would be, we've got a bigger threat here, which is 99% of the planet, which would remove us from power, whether legitimately or illegitimately, as in we believe they shouldn't remove us from power because they know better to hold it than we are. Whatever the reasoning, I would go out and I'd go as far as to say it's a fact that any sort of apex powers, if you want to call them that, around the world, have to either be stupid, and I can't believe that can be possible in any of them other than some small tribe in the middle of nowhere maybe. They have to be stupid to the facts of what I'm sort of getting across here, or they have to reach this tipping point of this cartelization concept where they look at each other and recognize that 99% of the planet are the only thing that can hurt them. And at that point, it makes far more sense for there to be collusion, especially especially in terms of the fact that the best way of bringing to heel that 99% that would want to drag them out and chop their heads off in the street half the time, the best way of imposing control over them is the narrative of statehood and nationhood and all the rest of it. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense, but I mean, it's massive, isn't it? And I mean, yeah. I can't. I sort of don't know where to start. But
to simplify it, this will make it better, so you don't feel like, because I've just thrown quite a lot of shit on the table.
I've got quite a lot of
but
pieces that we can start.
The very, very simplest thing I'm trying to get at, there's so many things in there where you could unpack 15 times in different directions, but the thing I'm trying to get at is Agamemnon's framework inherently just the true framework, and you shouldn't even bother thinking about whether or not there's anything outside of that, because so much of the gains can come from operating within this framework? Or should it be seen kind of the same, but with a slight more skepticism, in the sense that this is probably the best framework you can identify at the moment for analysing this stuff, but it is not woefully, but it is very, very, very focused in on this dynamic without saying everything there is to say about this dynamic, and therefore in all the senses of intellectual inquiry, you constantly be reminding yourself this works in this instance, but it's not true in and of itself.
Well, I think you should always do that.
You should always do that as habit, yeah. But when you get a framework like this, it's very, very easy to be like, we found it, we found the answer, kind of thing.
So yeah, you should always be like that. Secondly, I'm kind of sort of mid into it, I guess. So I'm not going to be able to kind of speak to the.
Of course.
But what I would say is, firstly, I mean, a lot of what you have talked about is kind of sovereign power, and I guess at least, Foucault, who's influenced Agamben, talked about 3 different types of power: sovereign power, disciplinary power, and biopolitical power. And we kind of touched on that last week.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, when you're saying power, I guess it is limited to the sphere that there are states, and that's the kind
true.
of main site of where power is operating and dominating society.
I suppose I'm sorry to interrupt you, but only just for clarity. I suppose I'm saying that when I'm saying, I shouldn't say the state. When I'm saying, that's why I'm kind of saying power. I mean all of the influences that I propose would, by necessity, coalesce into something that it's not the state. I'd say it could be split in 2 things. I'd say that there'd be the aware power structures that interact with each other, and then there'd be the unaware factors in terms of, the first one for me would be like this sort of whole animalistic subconscious need to dominate kind of thing. But then I think that also overlaps with tendencies, like the biopolitical tendencies towards biopolitical power, sovereign power. People could be respondents to and victims of what Foucault's saying there without actually having the terms or understanding that those things exist. They're still, because he's talking about tendencies and concepts. So I'd say the whole thing, I would put all that into a big pile and say, the emergent tendencies of power among human beings across that whole.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I wanted to kind of note on that is that, for Foucault, maybe less so for Agamben, but anyway, it's very much about power being decentered, the fact, the relationship between knowledge and power. I mean, we've talked about this. I don't want to go into massive detail. It's just something to note, because I think, well, in a sense, I'm not saying what you're describing. I know you're trying to kind of pose a question around Agamben, but that notion of power is a more sort of, I guess, traditional notion. I think that the other thing, is, and I've not sort of fully thought this through, and I'm just trying to think how many people would react to that. When you've talked about the sovereign, you have sort of almost like personalised it as if it is a king or a queen or a sort of individual. Whereas
I don't mean it that way necessarily.
Whereas obviously, I just want to
his definition. Sorry, I don't want to derail you, but his definition, the one who can define the exception, the one who in the end is at the decision making.
Yeah, point. And I've been thinking about this. So
it's not as simple as
who would that be in the context of what happened with COVID, right? Because there was a state of exception.
Yeah.
Obviously, to the extent, I mean, it was the Public Health Act that was used along with the new Coronavirus Act.
Yeah.
And the first of those got voted in by Parliament, in 1984, ironically enough. And and obviously the Coronavirus Act got voted in 2020, whatever day it was specifically. Now that was Parliament doing that, and that then gave the government, which is supposed to be the executive, the power to do all sorts of things based on their diktat. And it started to get all a bit confused, and there was I can't think of the guy's name now, but the ex-Supreme Court Justice who came out quite vocally against not only what was happening, but the process through which it had happened.
Yeah, I remember.
And his concerns about how this was undermining sort of, the British Constitution, which is not written down like the US one, but is more based on tradition and precedent and so on, and needs to be kind of respected, and usually is respected, and that had been kind of seriously undermined. But without sort of losing the thread of this, the question would be, who made that decision? Was it Parliament? In this case, because the government's got such a majority, Boris Johnson does seem like, he's the person able to make that decision. But
clearly, probably isn't.
But the point of saying that is that when so you were also talking about the sort of revolution, then a new regime, and it all being kind of, all lead into the same thing in a sense, all lead into that kind of consolidated power. And I just wanted to kind of reframe that in exactly what Agamben says, drawing on Walter Benjamin, which is there's different forms of power. So there's, Benjamin calls it law-making power and then law-maintaining power. So the revolution is, is upending the old order and then reconstituting a new sort of, constitutional order.
So law-making power would usually come down to force in a combination with old established norms.
Yeah, civil wars leading, where the old regime is challenged in its existing norms and laws, and a new order is put in place. But then it becomes obviously constituted power, and I think Benjamin and Agamben would sort of basically agree with how you presented it, in that in a way the multitude, the people, often in a civil war, take the Arab Spring or whatever as a recent example, kind of are mobilized. So when you think of that word constituent, so the law-making power is constituent power, and then the law maintaining power is constituted power. So it's being constituted. Then the constitution is often like the kind of document that can that sort of essentializes that. So in a way, and then think about what we're called in a democracy, constituents. That the local MP and the constituents, right? So there's a implicit within that is that the source of legitimacy of power in a democracy is the people, both in the sense of being constituents and in the sense of being able to vote in representatives who then represent them in Parliament. And again, concretise this in the COVID case. There was this might all be theatre. I mean, we can, but the scene. My view is, that there were, legitimate MPs that were critical of and captured, obviously, in all those power dynamics, and they're in a party and the government and the whip and all that kind of stuff. But we're extremely critical of it, and in some ways influenced, the response of the government and some of the speeches that were given by that Desmond Swayne and there's another guy.
Which is why I don't buy that there's that everything's completely contrived in some way. Like there's obviously pushback. There's always a lot of conflict in between.
So so that's one thing about who's sovereign and who's making those decisions, I guess. So then what the state of exception is in that context, because to go back to your kind of really provocative fundamental point, which I think in many regards Agamben would agree with, but I just want to sort of unpack it a bit more and maybe qualify it. I guess one of the things that has been said, and one of the most obvious things that has been said, is that there's a tendency towards that process, which is, let's just call it more democratic, right? With the constituents are constituted.
You would say there is a tendency towards?
Well, there's a tendency towards the normalisation of the state of exception. What you're what your kind of counter was that, in a way, it's a somewhat artificial distinction, because that's just when power sort of exposes its true self, because because it has to for whatever reason, or it just wants to.
It's forced to in order to maintain control over a given moment in history.
I think that's completely congruent, with Agamben and indeed Schmitt, who is drawing on there, because the way Schmitt's putting it, which I think Agamben accepts and adopts this, is that law, the nomos, as he calls it, can only apply to a set of factual circumstances. Like we've talked about this in the past. Now, what those factual circumstances are, you've kind of talked about some of them, in the, from power's perspective, it's to some degree the status quo, right? It's certainly not revolution, it's certainly not civil strife, it's certainly not the masses rising up, because in all those cases, the norms can no longer apply to facts, norms of, a sort of factual situation. And so under those circumstances, the sovereign, and Schmitt, absolutely supports this, has the power to step outside of the law, and reimpose the conditions in which the law operates. Now, the way you're kind of articulating that is from a perspective of kind of power and control and the limitations on that. If you were Schmitt as a conservative sort of, in some ways, anti-democratic thinker, he ended up being a jurist that was trying to justify the Nazi, provide. Yeah. He would say, similar to what you said about the Hobbesian argument. Yeah, without this, right, there's just a war of all against all. The sovereign has the absolute right to do that, and they reinstate those conditions. And actually, when Agamben is sort of politically analysing Schmitt, he recognised that what this argument meant was, and it's an obvious point in a way, and Schmitt agreed. There's passage where Schmitt actually, makes this explicit. In a way, Schmitt was being political about it. We're not having communist uprisings. We're not having, and at that point, it's almost like a civil war, right? Because the state just goes, okay, the law doesn't apply now. Now it's actually a war between us. And I can't remember what, I think it was,
Hang on, go back to where you said, where you started saying, where you said we're not having communist uprisings. I've lost you.
Yeah, so you could, so one of the things, like, let's just take the Weimar Republic as an example. It was an incredibly unstable situation where there was quite, radically divergent political interests and groups vying for kind of power and control. So it was very polarised, if you like. And communists were quite dominant amongst those. And I think, I don't know all the facts, but just to try and make the general point, sort of Schmitt, he says something like property, family, and something else. Basically the state has the right to just step outside the legal framework and just suppress, dissent or revolutionary turmoil in order to protect property, family, and I can't remember the other one that he mentions. So in a way, like I'm saying, there's nothing inconsistent in a way with what you're saying, although I guess someone of a different persuasion could frame it, well, it's not just about suppressing mass, or that's needed. But you kind of acknowledge that, right? You actually said, like with the Hobbes argument and so on.
Yeah.
So that's one point. So, but then just to think, okay, is the sort of state of exception argument therefore kind of irrelevant in that sense? Because, and I guess so Agamben looks at the period between the First World War and Second World War primarily as examples, and the extent to which the state of exception was being invoked and were becoming normalised, more so than previously. And there's been people that have kind of sort of criticised him in the sense that, well, you're just looking at and what about all the period afterwards? And obviously when the War on Terror was happening...
It was a pretty chaotic time.
Yeah, it was a pretty chaotic time, exactly. So you could just say, well, yeah, kind of course, because there was all these kind of exceptions. And I think, one of the sort of... I'm not saying he made this as a direct response, but if you sort of, if you read through, what he starts to say is that the state of exception doesn't even need to be invoked. What sort of replaces it, or is almost elided with it, is for reasons of security. Everything's more and more things start to be securitized, and when you securitize something, you take it out of something that's democratic, because everything's presented as an existential threat, which is similar to what the state of exception does, but rather than a kind of grand, there's an exception, there's a state of exception, more and more things fall within the purview of a security framework. And therefore democracy becomes more and more reduced. So yeah, I probably need to reboot now.
Yeah.
So I guess my main thing is I don't necessarily think his views are inconsistent with what you're saying, and indeed, in a way, I think probably some of the people, or many people who tried to use his work initially, more kind of in the sort of human rights space were like, okay, yeah, the state of exception is becoming normalized. We need to, especially say war on terror, we need to kind of pull it back.
Mm-hmm.
That's, and he never said that, because I think he always did see the almost sort of ontological, inherent nature of, Western democratic systems and the system of law. Drawing on Schmitt and saying, Schmitt was right. So there's something wrong here. And then the response, therefore, this is important. So you were talking about revolution, sort of then, just then instituting a kind of form of power. Like this is in a way maybe the final piece of the puzzle, and it's the one that I'm least familiar with. But so I rephrased that in sort of Benjamin's and Agamben's terms, in terms of constituting and constituent power and constituting power. And Agamben talks about
and that is power of the revolutionaries versus power of the people afterwards.
Lawmaking and law maintaining. Just to finish on the Arab Spring example, it's kind of like the people get mobilized, but then someone comes in to say, we're going to better represent that, but then sort of power kind of carries on in the way it mainly has done. And even if it has its democratic veneer, a lot of the substantive grievances and changes that are required for the population don't actually come to fruition. A lot of the demands that the revolution represented. Last point, like what Agamben actually therefore sort of views as and the other thing is, which is relevant to that, every time these things happen, and this is something you've talked a lot about in the past, these just become more. These are incorporated into strategies of power, right? So it's kind of like the false flag argument, or it's like the counterproductive effects of forms of revolt or resistance, because it just bolsters the security justifications. It's like, there's some civil unrest, right? We need more powers. It's this happening. Now there's even more threats and security problems and existential threats. So then it just provides more tools and more scope for, in the same way as the war on terror did. And that can either be real or imagined, just as the conditions for the state of exception can be real or imagined. But in a sense, in terms of the results of that, it doesn't matter. So Agamben's kind of like, we will get locked in this game, or in this kind, in a sort of game theory sort of sense. So he talks about destituent power.
Destituent.
Which is like destitution. It's that. That's the same, I guess, origin. And he talks about inoperability, or something like that. But basically, it's about how can you make this type of power inoperative. Which is more about strategies for making important these forms of power, these forms of sovereign.
So vitally, that would be because the states. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this clear. Because the state is, in that conception of reality, in a permanent war with its own citizenry, which I suppose is the key proposition there to get at. Because if it's at war with its own citizenry, that has to be a secret war. It instantly follows to that in order for it to be maintainable. There has to be, there has to be a narrative under which the citizenry don't realise they are the targets of this war, and that leads automatically into this whole thing of management of fear and the shock of when the unveiling, to put it in that term, emerges. It's of use to the power structure and all the rest of it. Once you're operating within those spheres,
which Agamben agrees with, I think.
And
once a global civil war.
Exactly. But then once it's it's squarely in the terms of people, the proposition. I suppose the precise proposition I want to know if you'd agree with is this automatic war against your own citizenry thing. Because as soon as you're in that situation, the exception, the global civil war. He's definitely agreeing with it to that point, to that degree. But once you make whether it's a leap or you go to the next step of saying that the unveiling that will come about from time to time, the exception, that unveiling when it comes about from time to time, if assuming Agamben would agree that it is an unveiling, that you're seeing something that is permanently there, it's not an exception, it's not an unusual set of circumstances.
Yeah, maybe
where
there's a qualification.
I think that's the thing. Yeah, so like I think if it seems like, I mean, it was pretty clear that I think his position is there are democratic forms, circumstances that come into play, systems that come into play, and then other powers that are operating within them cause them to be subverted for a brief moment, and then there's a rebalancing and things go back to how they were before. I'm saying that what it seems to me that it would be, under the basis of the initial premises I laid out there, would be that the curtain just drops for a minute and they go, oh shit, the TV show has just been witnessed. And I think there is a distinction between me saying that and him saying that, because to come back to what you were saying, the response is different. If it's all a facade, if it's all almost in that kind of a conspiratorial viewpoint at that point, that would be a conspiracy. If you could prove that every state on the planet operates in this way, we're talking about this in a very sort of very close to Agamben sense, so it seems like a conversation you could have with any academic, right? And maybe they'd absolutely burn it, but you wouldn't be an idiot to say what was to present it this way, right? But it's a very conspiratorial thing, you're saying. To believe that that's true would be to believe, or if you could prove that it's true, you would be proving that all states on the planet exist in a state of knowledgeable polarized enemy status to their own citizenry, and have as the number one priority to subjugate them any way they possibly can. Now, what's important there is that this depending how this plays out and what your conclusions are when you interrogate it enough, this unifies these two polarized worlds of the people, the conspiracy people and the straight-laced people. Because essentially, as long as they're not just completely going off the cliff, the conspiratorial cliff, and even when they're doing that, there's almost you can be forgiven for that in an environment of such chaos where what can you even know anymore? But just leaving those people aside, the general conspiratorial viewpoint is that power's ordered in a way that people don't really realise. It's far more coalesced than it is dispersed, and we suffer in ways that the only way we are ever going to escape this metaphorical prison would be for us to recognise that power is ordered in this way. Well, that accounts for all the conspiratorial viewpoints, and though all those conspiratorial viewpoints could sit down at the table with all the very traditional viewpoints and have a very intelligent conversation about it on the basis, I think this subject really creates a sort of forum to talk about that stuff in a way that's not flaky, that would put these people off, or equally so, it's not deluded in a way that would put the conspiratorial people off. So you don't recognise how this this operates, kind of thing.
Well, okay, I think I've got two qualifications. I might forget the first one, but so I'll start with the more important one.
We probably do need just for a one-word note to remind us.
I'll start with the more important one. I think. I guess the way you're framing it is that there's state structure, sovereign, power base, whatever you want to call it, that's objective is oppression, and then it has to unveil itself at certain times, otherwise it's there
based on circumstances, emergent circumstances.
I mean, just to go back to Schmitt, he would say, well, it's not oppression, it's kind of it's maintaining the necessary factual environment so that we can have the most affluent and secure and life that we have, because
which is a question of perspective, though, because that affluence causes the civilization we've got.
But I think it's important.
It's just not an inherent good. I don't know if you're going ahead, moving on from that proposition on the basis that affluence and comfort and the modern civilized way of life is inherently good, because I think that itself is questionable.
And I think Agamben questions that, because and that's, I think I've talked about this in the past, but then it links to the kind of end of history Fukuyama argument, whereby the political gets removed, right? Politics is supposed to be about sort of contestation and different views of the good life, which is kind of what you're getting at. Like, this isn't the good life, like, and we're having to live it. So that's totally recognised, and it's depoliticising. Obviously, if there's a set of factual things that this system is maintaining, and if those facts shift in a direction, like, the communists are getting the upper hand, or whatever, which whatever anyone thinks about those different factions or ideologies or whatever, the assumption is that in a democracy, so long as you get 51% of the vote, you can institute. And yeah, Schmidt would completely disagree with that, and I think a lot of people would. They're like, so that's one point. It's linked to the second point, which is, and this is Foucault's argument, and I think Agamben sort of accepts it but takes it somewhere different. The biopolitical argument was that, one of the reasons for state, its kind of form of rationalization, like, let's say, I can't remember what date he puts on it, but let's say sort of early 18th century onwards, and he documents the kind of, he does a kind of genealogy of, how these ideas and how these forms of power kind of emerged, and people's writings that were contributing to it. So I think it's pretty well, it's not just a sort of theory, if you like. He's kind of grounded it in looking at history and looking at the the writings and so on, especially looking at the physiocrats. That this power's also positive, and so it's not just the power to kind of oppress. It's the power, and this is that distinction between the sovereign power, which is to I can't remember. It's to kill or to let live, versus biopolitical power, which is to make live or let die.
Yeah.
And the let die bit is, so then if you see, and this is where a lot of the biopolitical literature has sort of started to explore in greater form. Power becomes productive of subjectivity, who people are, what people want. This is a little bit more the kind of Brave New World versus the 1984. You could look in that, but they're obviously sort of simple renditions and very sort of specific. But just to make just to put it on a different register. So then biopolitics, through all sorts of mechanisms, from public health to education systems, to different forms of disciplinary knowledge that inform social work, that inform policing, penal codes, and the idea of reforming character. It all becomes about applying different tools and techniques to be productive of life. Now, obviously, within the current status quo, let's just call it neoliberalism, that is very much, and it's not just the state, it's obviously then corporate power and market influence and all the rest of it, is creating particular subjectivities. And so Foucault talks a lot about norm construction. So not in terms of law, which is where sovereign power operates. You follow the laws of the sovereign, or we'll kill you. And back in the monarchical days, it's like, we can't catch you all, so we'll just hang, draw and quarter you when we do catch you, just to make a public display of what happens if you... actually most of the way in which power operates now, is the biopolitical argument, is that actually this is about biopower. It's about acts on the individual body, which is disciplinary power. So you're regimented, you're in the school, there are both forms of knowledge and sort of, you take the military barracks as, an extreme example. People are drilled, people are disciplined into particular forms of life and behavioural responses and all the rest of it. And there's the biopolitical, which, or in its broader sense, which is about acting on a population, so public health measures, etc., etc. And I would agree with the proposition that it's useful to look at sort of oppressive forms of power and productive forms of power. I think analytically, I don't think in practice you can draw a line, because how people experience those things, and especially because they norm creating so then you're creating norms. Anything that deviates from those norms needs correcting, right? And either through its own, when people feel like they're a deviant, there's a kind of, Foucault talks about technologies of the self. You kind of, it's that inner voice. It's that it's that sort of social pressure around deviating from the norms, or the state, different apparatuses of power, act on that. Even civil society organisations, philanthropic organisations, all these kind of things are kind of acting on the population and trying to kind of regulate or control it. So I think, just speaking about sort of oppression and so on is maybe a kind of is not a sufficiently kind of is not an adequate sort of framework to look at the way in which power operates. And indeed, any society would always have to have that productive form of power in a sense. But where Agamben goes with that is, well, firstly, even Foucault, right? So what he said. So the question then is, like, if you take totalitarian regimes as an example, Nazism was biopolitical in a radical sense, because it was saying, and in a racialized sense and so on, it was saying. So if you're trying to, if that's the let die element, make live and let die. So the make live is the kind of productive force of power, trying to kind of trying to promote public health, trying to promote different educational attainment.
I might not be understanding this. I always go a little bit vague with this stuff. So I think that the Nazis are a good example. Maybe it'll help me understand it. Talking about the Nazis in terms of them being biopolitical, but all the make-live things like that, the concepts that we're talking about in relation to that modern biopolitics, and I can see it in this state of affairs. But if what we're talking about moving into now, in the biopolitical reality that we can see here, if the Nazi regime can be called biopolitical, and the fact that it practiced biopolitics, it did it in a wildly different way to the one we've got. It wasn't. People weren't being the way we're recognising it in the state, the medical system.
No, but they did. This is where I'm going with it. They did. So there was. You can look at like, let's take the body as an analogy, right? There's the body politic, right? And then there's the body, and so you made certain analogies, right?
Yeah.
If there's anything that we deem to be a foreign agent or deviating from the norms of like our regulatory internal structures that are trying to create are trying to create the integrity of our bodily maintenance, then our immune system comes in and our killer T cells and all that, and
the Jews were a virus.
Yeah, exactly. And so you get
let's not cut that one clip out and centralise it above everything else.
Yeah. In Hitler's view, the Jews were a virus. Let's just put that before it. So you can see how a very kind of pathological make live, if defined,
as in make the social body live, by protecting it from these people that are a problem for.
Well, that's that's the let die side of it. So who's been let die? The refugees try to come across on the across the English Channel and just saying that let's not pull them out of the water if they.
Well, hang on. This
is the Homo Sacra thing, right? So this is the.
But they're not within our. They're not within. So this is something that transcends boundaries. It's like it's not. We're not talking about within the nation. We're not talking about one sovereign.
You can do it within the nation then, because then the communists, like I was talking about earlier, within the context of the Weimar Republic, or those that are being radicalised by jihad, and we don't even have to say they're not committing violence. Maybe they're not even talking about violence, but they're being radicalised in however that's defined. The vectors of disease spread, right? The asymptomatic carriers of COVID. Like, when you apply a really kind of intensive sort of. So that's where the biopolitical literature goes, and you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But you can see how these things become pathologized. So yes, it's good we have a national health system. We're looking after the health of but that then becomes it intensifies the borders, and this comes back to Agamben's point. So who's on the inside, who's on the outside, and the state power is based on its ability to claim who is on the inside and who is on the outside, and that's a fundamental essential sort of characteristic of it. But maybe just to sort of finish it off with the Nazi example, obviously then that was an extraordinarily pathological form of biopolitics.
I understand.
You cannot say it wasn't protecting its. It was doing all sorts of. They did campaigns against smoking. They pioneered things before even, you know. They were extremely, progressive, if you want to use that term, in terms of the attention
that's the problem
to
with
detail.
being hyper progressive. When you start off saying don't smoke, you end up saying let's kill all the disabled people.
Exactly.
Because there's it's very, you can see how it's easy when if you're just operating on a logic. It is a fact that disabled people aren't as capable members of the workforce as other people. So on that pure logic, you can make the argument that these aren't as productive for the society, and before you know it, which is the problem with logic.
And probably more the argument, although I don't know the details of what it was, it would be more about the genetic purity, inheritance, because your object, if you take that make live to an extreme, right, how do we strengthen the genetic pool so that we are getting stronger and stronger and stronger? Well, wait a minute, there's these, and how do we protect the sort of the cultural and the German spirit and and all the, well, there are these communists and Jews and
there's a really interesting thing here, right, of like
I do want to bring it back to what you said. I mean, I want to make sure.
Okay, I'll be really quick. But it's not going to be often I'm found to be going, you can see what Hitler was doing, right? But you can see how it captivated people. If you imagine, if you take the zoomed out Alexander the Great view of history. Let's say some horrendous biopolitical regime got control of the entire planet now through the most ridiculous James Bond villain sense you can imagine. And we had this unbelievably chaotic 50 years, followed by a pretty damn chaotic 200 years. But then 500 years later, with this homogenized global blah, 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 blah. And then someone looks back 10,000 years before that, and they see that we've had this... I'm talking about, let's say they wiped out, in that chaotic period, they wiped out every disabled person. Let's leave aside the science about whether or not that's going to actually remove it from the gene pool, right? Whatever the given disability is. But let's say it was scientifically based, and let's say they did remove the things out, because that is science. Like, there are certain things that if it was gone out of the gene pool, it would be gone out of the gene pool, unless it came in via another mutation, right? So there's a way that the science could make certain arguments, only up to a certain level, but it could do that. 20,000 years later, no one would give a fuck about the sensibilities of the given culture that had to lose a load of its citizens and under these certain circumstances. 20,000 years later, they'd look back and they'd look like we see Genghis Khan storming across Europe and annihilating a quarter of the people. We'd go, ooh, that's a statistic, basically, and we'd be like, you can see how we wouldn't, I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, but it kind of doesn't mean anything for practical purposes in discussing it. We don't get emotional about all those people getting wiped out in Europe. It completely changed the genetic picture of the planet. Now, when you're Hitler and you get caught in a grand idea and you're seeing yourself as looking from that perspective, from that grand perspective, and looking back, the people who would argue with you are insects. The people who argue with you, they're just looking through a toilet roll tube, at what reality is. So when you're starting from that position, and then you're imposing things that, I suppose it's pointless derailing you any further. But all I'm saying is that you can see how it's not as simple as this fucking psycho. Look at what it did. You can see how from within, in the moment, especially when it's combined with a grand national narrative of look at the, and this is a lot of what radical Islam did as well, has been or does. You can see how, hypothetically does, I don't know, I've not looked into it, but I'm just saying these seem to be the same motifs. When you've got a narrative that looks out to the world and says, it's depraved in the sense of what radical Islam does, I don't even think it's a radical Islam. I think it rightly recognises, the sort of Babylon nature of the West and all the rest of it. And someone like Hitler looking and saying, look at whatever it was that he pointed to and said, this is the degradation of everything outside our borders. We are the last bastion of the light kind of thing. It's almost like that Roman thing. It's not, at that point, it's not like, how did these people lose their minds for this insanity? You can see how it's capitalising on a very, 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 very deep primitive needs, while also having an inherent logic to it, devoid of momentary empathy within the historical moment.
Well, I think, I think that's a fair point, and I think in a way that's why, well, there's an obvious sense why human rights and humanism sort of, really became people became acutely aware of the need, of the need for that. Because,
growth industry.
Because, going back to the individual versus the collective, if you're viewing at the population level, which is what biopolitics is predominantly doing, then those things can sort of start to creep into
go in that direction.
Logic, because okay, we have to put those on the outside because they're a threat, right, to the body politics, the population. Whereas, human rights point of view is like, no, there are, individuals, and there are certain inalienable, rights and conditions that need to be respected and so on. There is something kind of, there's a link between biopolitics and the exception, because in a way, sovereign, theories about sovereignty and sovereign power and so on are very much around our kind of more legal ones. It's about rights, it's about citizens' rights, it's about the ability of sovereigns to institute laws that people have to follow. And what are laws? Well, they are general statements. They're not speaking about specific facts. They're providing general statements that then people have to operate within. Do you know what I mean? They, by their very nature. And so, Agamben, drawing on others, makes a distinction between, and Foucault does, governmentality, governance, and sovereignty, and which is more in the juridical and lawmaking sense. Governance, however, has to respond to all the minutiae, all these things around the population, all these things around where sort of disciplinary powers operating. Foucault's definition of it in a very broad sense is the conduct of conduct. Yeah. Right. How are people's conducts being influenced, manipulated, and so on.
The exception is a historical event that occurs in these moments of crisis, the barbarians at the gates type of a thing, and then normal democratic, as far as I understand it, I ain't read enough of him yet, but I think he believes that there are normal democratic processes and that it returns to them, and then we exist at that, and then power pushes it into that situation again, and they suspend power. I know he goes a bit further in saying, I'm pretty certain he goes further in saying, if that can be suspended by the whim of the sovereign, then democracy doesn't exist. I'm pretty sure there is something in there along those lines, and I can't see how they can't be. How could you not? Like, it's just factually inaccurate to say that if the sovereign can arrest everything that you call your democratic norms whenever they want, then you live in a dictatorship. You don't live in a democracy. It's just a fact, unless I'm missing something there. His statement that exception, that moment of exception, is now becoming the norm, or the normal mode of governance. The way you would say that in the language of what I was saying is that the unveiling that occurs occasionally. So I'm saying that it's an unveiling that occurs occasionally when the reality, the hidden rule reality that exists behind the curtain has to drop, because it's just for purposes of convenience and necessity. It's the power in question. It's far more convenient to it to drop the curtain for a second and then re-establish the curtain than it would be. Like the losses gained in people going, holy shit, I just saw behind the curtain, aren't that big of a deal when compared to the alternative that power would have to consider rather than just dropping the curtain. Does that make sense? A bit word salad, but you know what I mean.
There might not be any other option, really.
Yeah, and it might just be that. It might not be like, oh, well, this is the best bet. It might be right. Well, there's no alternative right now than for people to see behind the curtain and see that this is basically just raw power that functions, and the democracy doesn't exist in terms of that factual way I just said. That I think Agamben would agree with. So in these words, that rather than the exception is becoming the normal mode of governance, I think it could be worded that the unveiling, which used to occur occasionally based on emergent circumstances like a technological advancement like the internet or whatever the thing was that the normal order can't recognise and respond to fast enough, that those historical moments when that occurs are now becoming the normal mode of governance. It's a switch in definition there of the unveiling, which used to occur in moments, is becoming a permanent unveiling. Well, by definition, what that would be, if that was true, the permanent unveiling of power is the switch from the carrot mode of governance, the Brave New World mode of governance, where there's a narrative constructed, be it chemically or through narrative and culture or whatever, but there is a narrative that keeps people compliant, that has been dropped, and it's now the stick by necessity or whatever, but for whatever reason it's the same thing. So all I'm saying is it's an interesting, just a slight change of language, where he's saying the exception is now becoming the normal mode of governance. The way that you would say that in the language of the other thing would be to say that the unveiling, which occurs occasionally, has now become a permanent unveiling, which is just another way of saying the carrot that we've had under different guises is now becoming a permanent stick, whether for temporarily, because a more, for whatever, but a longer period than Agamben's thing, like for it to be, maybe it's just going to be a 50-year stick followed by a load of other pretend carrots that are actually just disguising a stick in order to keep people compliant, or, and I lean this way to be honest, or whether the switch currently from carrot to stick, an unveiling of the raw power that exists behind the curtain, is as a result of us living on the cusp of an era where technology, for the first time ever, could realistically impose a permanent hegemony of this asymmetric power, this hypothetical asymmetric power. As soon as that technology exists for them to do that, for power to do that, whether or not it's just nature, whatever it is, the tendencies emergent from human nature.
Yeah, forms of dominance.
Yeah,
and the people and current institutions that
exactly.
occupy
all the
those
things.
Positions of dominance.
Yeah, not necessarily pick your conspiracy, your conspiracy motif, but just that it's that it could be that permanent. The reason for that more consistent unveiling rather than veiling is because the technology exists now for over a given period for us to switch into this other mode of permanent hegemony, and that actually, I think this is an important final point, and that actually within that period, that historical period of switching from one way of being to one other order of being over 50 years or whatever it turned out to be, within that zone, one of the best things for power to orchestrate, limit, mitigate, restrict, whatever, would be the drip, the rate at which truth emerged. The rate at which the shock factor, because if for there to be an unveiling, there could be, if it happens in a certain way, people could respond against it, and there could be new ideas and new ideologies that arise to have intelligent conversations about it and respond to it. If it happens very quickly, then there can be a shock factor where people end up being just more, like we were talking about before, more respondents to what's going on, reflexively, animalistically responding in a fear way, which then actually just supports the kind of status quo, the grand scheme status quo kind of thing, of this power dynamic. So I think that, and I think this is why I think it's really important that it's not. I think it's short-sighted when people, and I think you see it a lot, and I've done it myself, but I think it's short-sighted when people automatically see unveiling as being inherently good. Like, we can see more now. It may be that unveiling, maybe not with you personally, but that unveiling is having a net effect which is in support of power and a detrimental effect on the people, because the unveiling is causing shock in a certain way, or it's doing whatever. Or at least, and even if you discount that, I'm just saying that within that period of transition, you could expect the unveiling to be regulated in different ways to support the transition, not to support people, whereas people genuinely automatically assume if I'm seeing more, I'm now more aware, I'm better off, but you may be learning it in a way that doesn't necessarily support you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think it gets to the root of a lot of people who think alternatively. I hear people get super excited about the internet's going to change everything. Now we can see everything. Not necessarily. Like, just because something has an immediate benefit to you in terms of expanding your knowledge, it could be expanding into spheres that you are going to take time to react to those things if you're going to have it help you, and actually your immediate reaction to that new knowledge could be of detriment to you, and that you don't see for 2 decades.
Yeah, I guess what I want to add to that is that, and we sort of said it before, the people, like you're talking about an unveiling, and then people seeing, the kind of power and its oppressive tendencies. Not
as a fact. I'm just saying as a proposition.
I think that's in a sense fair as a proposition, but I guess what it's not acknowledging is the other side of that, and this is something that Agamben's critical of, so this is not his view, but it certainly would be like the view of Hobbes and the view of Schmitt and so on, that I guess, it's saying that power's legitimate. It's
from a certain perspective.
Yeah, from a certain perspective.
From a perspective of almost nature and the tendencies.
Hobbes talks about the state of nature, right? So that's why sovereign power is necessary in order to prevent the war of all against all.
It's very much like a realpolitik sort of position, whereas but that's counter to what most people's lived experiences.
You could be saying, and I think people sort of intuitively go along with this, and I don't agree with this, but I think you could be saying that which is the sort of Schmittian argument that well, I don't know it's his argument exactly, but it's based on that democracy is valuable. It's better to live in. It means the people are having some degree of control over some areas of their life. But let's not forget that if the facts change, if there's civil strife, revolutionary turmoil where people are going to get dispossessed of the property if the communists get in, if Al Qaeda manage to get cells all over Britain and then start chemical warfare and so on. You know what I mean? The whole security angle. So the state that so the argument would be, well, of course we want the state to react. Of course we want. I think what at least one of the things this pushes us to do, and I think some of the biopolitical films are good at exposing this, like take Children of Men. It's like, it's precisely that. What is democracy really, and how much are we actually committed to it, and under what conditions? Because as soon as there's, even like we've been talking a lot about COVID, even what is maybe a twice a century event, we're willing to jettison that, or we're willing to jettison it because of the spectacle of 9/11 and the and what in I think some reasonable grounds to say it's not the biggest threat in the world like terrorism, right? I think that's important, because I think just saying, there's this pernicious negative power and it's unveiling itself and it's doing that. Do you know what I mean? It's more complicated than that. And I guess you've got to say, well, what is the alternative? I
mean, it's probably more complicated than that. But you could to throw the sort of grenade in there a little bit, this gets to that whole the biggest division between the idea of something being more controlled, the way the world is shown to us to operate, versus the way the world may operate if there is a more coalesced and more controlled way that it could operate. The way that there's arguments that can be made for why, well, it's just too chaotic and all the rest of it. But what I'd say is that it gets back to the trauma point that I sort of laid out in that initial thing. Sometimes complicated systems can be seen to be, there's just no way you could order this thing. But if you're controlling a primary stimulus, like I can go to a swamp in a forest and I can raise the acidity by raise or lower. Can't remember which way the pH scale works, but I could alter the acidity by 2 points, and I will eradicate 15 forms of life that exist in that swamp. And all I've done is put some drops into the swamp. In the same way, I believe you can increase trauma within the global societal body, each nation, however you want to do it. The general, net, the general totality of trauma within the human system, and you will increase authority. You will increase the likelihood for people to come under the control of authoritarianism and all the rest of it. So I'm saying you could have all those things. You could have, the Enlightenment philosophers, and you could have everything that's happened in the 20th century. You can have Gandhi. You can have all these things, and they're all brilliant. But increasing trauma into the system just destroys them all. So I think the way you could actually hypothesize an extremely radically conspiracist view of the way the world operates would be to say that certain powers, or you could absolutely have one Bond villain if you want to even go to this degree. I'll go this far to make the point. You could have one. You can't have one Bond villain, but you can have systems that can orchestrate trauma. The media, whatever else, right? You could have
one Bond villain, because all you've got to do is, create a threat. Right? That's all you need to do.
But it's easier to make the point of having states all recognise that the way their citizenry is brought to heel is by them being afraid and generally being traumatized, putting through school systems that can traumatize them, all the different things that you can do. By doing, and that's all I'm saying. I don't want to stretch the point out so much, because I just think it's quite a good final or second to final point, that you can have all the confusion and complication of our social order, and you could look at that as a dictator or as a number of dictators, hidden dictators if you want to go to the extreme. You could look at it and say, I don't give a shit about all these Enlightenment philosophies and the internet and all these different things. Just, where's the trauma meter? Oh yeah, we're still good. As long as the trauma meter's up there, all that stuff, what it ends up being actually is furniture on a stage that ends up convincing people that everything's chaotic and complicated, and look, and this is changing, and now we can be enthusiastic about this, when the trauma's still up there. The psychological, the animalistic need to have control over other people still exists. There's all these things that, derive from it that are,
yeah, but then in you describing that, that you're placing a agentive actor or set of actors that, like you said,
only in the natural sense
to heal.
Yeah, only in the sense that most men, and maybe even me, in that sort of Jordan Peterson sense, that any of us put in that situation because we're being governed by probably way up. Well, I think they know it's like 70-80% of all of our functions are operating from subconsciously on basic sort of primitive needs that we're not consciously aware of. That you put us in those situations of that power, and we are going to manifest the exact same behaviour as anybody else. Then you only need that to add to it, and just go, all right, we'd all do that.
Yeah. Well, and another way of putting that, and this is security and insecurity. So security.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. So the more insecure,
if your needs are met, you're not traumatized. If you're in a relationship of power to your own existence, you're not traumatized.
And so I think another really important thing around the state of exception and its relationship to crisis, right? Because we constantly we drip fed crisis after crisis after crisis.
With a reason.
We've gone from COVID to Ukraine. There was the war on terror. There's constant wars, there's constant crisis, there's metaphorical wars, there's real wars. And so what Agamben sort of says to Schmidt is like, your premise is that these occasional exceptions that the state then needs to act, or the sovereign needs to act, in order to return to the factual basis, the normal state of affairs that the norms, the laws can then apply to. But what happens when when it is just a permanent crisis? Then there is no factual basis. And I think one of the things he's saying is that the exceptions becoming the norm because the system, neoliberal capitalism, whatever, is anarchic. It is anarchy.
Yeah.
This is the anarchy. You're not protecting against the anarchy. We live in it.
I think what's really important thing to bring this back for everyone though is that dynamic of creating trauma and fear in someone else to create a power disparity in your own animalistic favour. Everyone can see it everywhere. It's the reason some patriarchal wanker dad dominates the home life in a sense of making those kids terrified to even speak up or whatever. Do you know what I mean? The way that a state does it, the way that there's, you can see how increasing trauma and destabilization with someone increases their need to pass that authority over to you. It exists in every walk of life, and it doesn't need, this is why I think this point were important, it doesn't require agency. It just requires, in the same way that patriarchal father recognizes that instinctively, if I scare you, I will have more power. That it goes on at every level, and it doesn't require a boardroom of cigar chomping conspiracists. It's just the way that people function, and you see it coalesce societally in a way that can be interpreted as a grand conspiracy because it looks like agency and consistency, but it's only consistent in the sense that the human nature is consistent, I would suggest.